Our next speaker is Mr. John Drew, who is the former Chancellor of Regent's University, UK. John has been involved with Regent's University, London, where as its first Chancellor, he took the theme of values in his initial speech and contributed to their development over recent years in discussions with companies, government authorities, NGOs, schools, and universities. John Drew, please.
Good afternoon or good day. Values, past, present, and future, personal values, organizational values, global values. I want to cover them all a little bit. I feel particularly privileged to talking with you today, having lived and lectured and worked in India over many years with Indian friends and companies. Delhi and Mumbai are always close to my heart. Today, may I share with you some thoughts concerning university students and younger people. We have worked values at Regent's University during the last 10 years. There are undergraduates and graduates from 142 countries working and living on its wonderful campus in Regent's Park in the centre of London. It's truly an international school with well-defined values. More important, its values are regularly implemented across all the courses. But before going into this, please note again the title of my talk. It is about the past, the present, but most important, it's about future values. May I encourage you to think about this personally, organizationally, your university or company, for example, and national or global values. May I ask you, what are your personal values? Does your university or company promote them? Are you asked to contribute to them? Being World Values Day, what could you do after this meeting, together with friends or colleagues, to further discuss any new ideas you may have developed during the conference? Tolstoy, the famous Russian, once wrote that there are only two fundamental questions in life: how to live and what to live for. How to live and what to live for. These are the only two questions we need to address in life, he said. Well, you know, most of us know how to live and have opportunities to aspire towards it. But for many people, what to live for is something we often, and always, not always, but often put off for later in life while we get on with living it. But we can't afford to do that any longer. Over the last 50 years, earning a living has become easier for many, and the quality of life has become more to the forefront. Even billionaires like Bill Gates become more involved with what to live for, and there are tens of millions of others asking this question now. How to live used to be followed very much later by what to live for. Now perhaps they're both being addressed at the same time. Young people have access to so much through technology, so at a very early age, almost before they launch themselves into the world, they are raising the what to live for much earlier on in our sparrow's flight from the well-protected cradle to the further off but nonetheless inevitable grave. Values are relevant to all this. They're widely discussed much more today than for many centuries. In the past, values were often expressed or understood through the individual actions of individuals. They were often based on learned texts of many religions, or later on, national constitutions and statements from international organizations such as the World Bank or the United Nations. In the West, and perhaps too much has been emphasized in the West, perhaps we should begin thinking not about the West, but the globe, because everyone has their views of where the West, their particular West begins, and the West begins differently in the Middle East, or in India, or in Latin America. In the West, historically, liberty, equality, and fraternity became memorable words after the French Revolution of 1789. But they were redefined and stated widely across the world meaning perhaps freedom paired with openness and tolerance and equal opportunity and a strong defense of the public good. Traditional religions, of course, played a major part in defining values, and still do, but to a lesser extent in many, but not all nations. There's often now a demand to define values, individual, organization, national and international. But you know, defining values is one thing. Applying them consistently and measuring actions against them is much more complex and takes much more time. As Chancellor of Regent's University, I took the theme of values during my tenure of office. We discussed values internally, informally, and formally in lots of meetings and writings and discussions. Like many institutions in government, business, and academia, we reviewed them and published our core values. But some of them still need to be unpicked further, and I don't think we've got as far as I'd hoped we would do, because values is something which is a continuing problem for all of us. They're very well articulated by many organizations now, but the key issue is how do you implement them and how to continue to do so as part of an organization's development and as a contribution to this dramatic changing world. Oliver Cromwell talked about values in the UK centuries ago. He said, "Those go furthest who know not whither they go." It happened to him too. Today, the world does not really know where it is going. We can only think of Cromwell's thoughts and perhaps hope for the best. Those go furthest who know not whither they go, but do something about trying to find out where they're going to. Work on values requires multidisciplinary approach to define them. They mustn't just be a public relations communication, sounding interesting, but signifying nothing much. A recent graduate, at a very top major hedge fund, the first question they asked him was, "What are your values?" Not a bad question, you might think. What would you reply if asked it? Have you really thought about how to reply? Neither have most of us. You got me thinking of mine again, talking about values, but can you rattle them off straight away what your key values are? And if individuals can't articulate them, why expect companies or nations to do so? But there's a growing number of organizations now, companies, non-governmental organizations, trade unions, schools and universities. They really do define them. Some, like Diageo, Unilever and KPMG, attempt to live and expect to be judged by them. Of course, governments and religious, spiritual, ethical and meditative inspired organizations often talk about them and have much to say. But it isn't really very easy if you think about it, particularly in a global sense. A Chinese minister of education once said that Chinese universities cannot accept textbooks which promote Western values. This didn't cause much of a stir in China, but it did in certain parts of the world, wondering what Western values really were and what national values really are. And perhaps it's a good thing that the values are up for discussion. It's better than throwing bombs, threatening war, running corrupt organizations, ignoring civil society, or economic and global and national imbalances. Lawrence Freeman mentioned 200. The actual internet suggests at least 287 ways of defining values and provides millions of references. There's no shortage of ideas and input. Some say that discussion of values is a short-term public relations initiative and it will disappear in time. I wonder whether that's so. The COVID-19 crisis is not only providing room for thought rather than activity, but asking questions of how values can balance serious illness versus death and economic growth. Core values will not just have to be defined, but may lead to different organizational ways of managing organizations and defining their objectives in order to make more satisfying lives for those who are in them. It could be argued that defining values is just 1% of the problem. Communicating them is 19%, and 80% is living them and being judged by them. Important conferences like yours are a step in the right direction, but it's the 80% that matters. The 1% is pretty easy, 19% takes time, but it's continuing to implement them that really matters. They're having to look at much wider issues now than before, and such things as inclusiveness, sustainability, gender and community come into the problem. They can't just be a top-down activity. They must be part of and help encourage involvement and commitment at all levels. Consideration of them leads to values being included in different words in different ways, like respect, behavior, responsibility, judgment. And it's great to see these words being used by organizations and companies rather than just getting on doing what they were always doing. Saint-Exupéry in The Little Prince said, "As for the future, your task is not to foresee, but to enable it." As for the future, your task is not to foresee, but to enable it. For values, our task is not just to define them for others, but perhaps to help and enable discussion for them, both personally, for the organizations with which we are involved, and for future global society to which we are moving, however slowly. There is no alternative. Values, culture, behavior, integrity, freedom of thought, peace, rule of law, call them really what you will. But in this terrifying world, discussion of them is a way ahead, leading through meetings, definitions, and media coverage to statements and objectives which can be communicated, lived, and assessed. Among organizations taking values seriously, there are very many top companies. Diageo, who say, "At the heart of everything we do are our company values. We stand by them, being the set of behaviors that we expect all our people to embrace to further our ambitions for our business, our people, and our communities." Cambridge University says their purpose and values is to contribute to society through the pursuit of education, learning, and research to the highest international levels of excellence. Our core values are freedom of thought and expression and freedom from discrimination. Well, these are fine words, but you know, over the last 50 years, people and organizations, business or government, didn't really write about these things or talk about them. Now they do. KPMG, which is a top accounting firm, puts values at the heart of its code of conduct and requires worldwide standards for its partner firms. It says, "We want to lead by example, work together, respect the individual, seek facts and provide insight, open and honest communication to communities, above all, to act with dignity." London Business School, where I once worked, defines its values as communal, courageous, engaged, and eclectic, undermining everything we do, guiding our actions, defining our culture, and living them to deliver a positive experience to all who engage with us. But you know, these companies and these schools, these organizations have only been talking about values over the last 5 or 10 years, not for the last 50 years. Sometimes they've lived them, sometimes they didn't. Unilever, Pricewaterhouse, Barclays, Santander, or others who define clearly their values, along with many government organisations, the UK National Health Service, the UK Government Recruitment Services, and thousands of organisations across the world. Numbers growing all the time. Some universities have professorships in values or similar words. Regular employee consultations, communications, and feedback requirements ensure that this is not just a one-off effort. As one company put it, it's not really an act of charity, but it's in self-interest. And I think that's another point to make. It's of self-interest for organizations to look at and define their values and to implement them and to be judged by them. There's still much to do, but the trend is clear. The ancient Egyptian view, again, was 2,000 years ago or 3,000 years ago. They said, "The good life profits man." Shows the trends today in millions of websites. Values can no longer be stated and left to fester in corners of the internet. There are too many pressures, too many communications, too many genuine attempts to widen consideration of values at all levels into the future. Could there be a science of values developing? Inward-bound courses proliferate now, and words like mindfulness, meditation, yoga, therapy, psychology, spirituality are all along with values in current and growing discussion and interpretation. Jean Monnet was a founding father of the concept of Europe, and he said that Europe would develop by small steps. He also said that if he had his life again, he would have started with culture. How the world will change, and hopefully for the better, could be through cultures. Defining them will be the task of values. Applying them will be up to the successor generations, and others like us can only admire, support, and enthuse. Thank you.
Your mute, Raoul.
Yeah, thank you, John. Thank you very much for your deliverance and how giving us examples of how you different organizations, institutions, government, everybody is paying more importance to values and how it should be. Thank you for your deliverance once again. There is a question to John Drew. Where do values originate and what is the best way to practice and profess them? John, can you hear me? Oh, sorry. John, can you hear me? Can you
Yes.
guys? Yeah, John.
You...
Yeah, John. So the question is, where do values originate and what is the best way to practice and profess them?
I think that values originated originally by people leading lives, often through belief in their religions and adhering to what their religions taught. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, John.
Fine. But when you talk about personal values, I think it's really quite complex because, of course, maybe you should think of your own values, make them from the range of the 287 values you can change, and then see what's the ones that are key for you. I'll give you an example of how you can maintain them. My son writes the first letter of his 4 values on his ankle, and it's and no one else can see it but him, but it reminds him every day of the 4 values that he has to work at. I felt myself that I'd probably say that integrity, openness, and honesty are 3 of my values, but tomorrow perhaps there'll be different ones. But I think the main thing is that as long as companies and as long as individuals have some idea what their values are, like as I mentioned, the person going for a very big job, and the first question they said was, "What are your values?" And you can imagine what that happened in the business school at Regent University. And you can imagine after that, several hundred people went for interviews. They're always sure they were able to say what their values were. So I don't know, I can say where they originate from. I can say that thinking about them, talking about them, developing them, then living by them and being judged by them is the key thing. I think that Diageo, for example, not only say what their values are, but they send a letter to all 50,000 people in the company every year and saying, have we kept to our values? Are there anything we should do differently? And you know, they get 90% reply from people. And so they are really deeply conscious of what the values of their company were. And I think that what happens too often is that organizations, universities, schools, and businesses write down their values. They talk about them for a day or two, have a few conferences, and then they forget about them. So I think it's the consistency of values matters. Doesn't matter whether they change. Doesn't really matter what they are within those 287 possibilities, as long as people talk about their inner selves rather than outer selves, rather than going to shopping at supermarkets, that they spend more time thinking, like Lawrence would suggest, through meditation, just being quiet and thinking about their values.
Thank you, John. Thank you.